Welcome to the Story Channel. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few notes. The content in this video uses AI-generated images and voice narration, combined with the channel's creative editing. Everything is intended solely for entertainment purposes and does not depict or reflect any real events or real people. Hope you enjoy the story and have a great time watching.
The acoustics of Probate Courtroom 302 were architecturally designed to amplify the solemn authority of the law. But this morning, they were perfectly calibrated to amplify a theatrical performance of maternal grief. Margaret Harrington, my mother, was weeping into a monogrammed white linen handkerchief. It wasn't a loud, disruptive, or ugly sob. It was a masterclass in calculated, suffocating, upper-class devastation. She sat at the petitioner's table, just her trembling hand resting delicately on the polished mahogany, while my father, William, placed a comforting, stoic arm around her shoulders. He looked up at the presiding judge with the exhausted, deeply pained eyes of a patriarch who was bravely watching his family shatter into a million pieces. I sat exactly 15 feet away at the respondents' table. I did not weep. I did not fidget. I did not look at them with betrayal, panic, or fragile, heartbroken disbelief. For the last 15 years, that I hadn't just participated in the commercial real estate market of the Pacific Northwest, I had ruthlessly dominated it. I built Harrington Estates from a single, heavily leveraged warehouse acquisition into a $40 million empire of high-density, mixed-use urban developments. I employed 250 people. I controlled the voting shares of a board of directors that managed $500 million in active construction assets. I didn't sleep. I didn't take vacations. And I lived on black coffee, calculated risks, and a relentless predatory drive to win. And my parents, who had never worked a single day in the commercial sector, were currently sitting in a closed probate court, attempting to steal absolutely every single cent of it. They weren't attempting a hostile corporate takeover. They weren't trying to outmaneuver me in a boardroom. They were using a legal mechanism so archaic, so profoundly invasive, and so terrifyingly absolute that it is usually reserved for the comatose or the profoundly disabled, a permanent, involuntary conservatorship. Resting on the elevated oak bench in front of the Honorable Judge Thomas Sterling was a 200-page medical dossier. It was beautifully bound, meticulously indexed, and entirely fraudulently fabricated. 6 months ago, my parents realized that my company was preparing for an initial public offering, IPO, a move that would completely dilute their minimal, symbolic minority shares and permanently sever their access to my corporate expense accounts. They panicked. But instead of hiring corporate lawyers, they hired Dr. Eris Thorne. Dr. Thorne was a high-profile, incredibly expensive concierge psychiatrist who catered exclusively to the city's elite. For a quiet, untraceable bribe of $300,000, funneled through a shell charity, my mother ostensibly managed for marine conservation, straight into an offshore trust in the Bahamas, Dr. Thorne had produced a masterpiece of medical perjury. He formally diagnosed me with early-onset frontotemporal dementia, compounded by severe, aggressive, paranoid delusions. My parents had spent half a year secretly building the narrative to support his diagnosis. You know, when I lost my apartment keys because I had worked a 110-hour week closing a downtown high-rise acquisition, my mother documented it as severe cognitive decline and memory loss. When I fired a corrupt general contractor and changed the security codes to my penthouse, my father logged it as a violent, paranoid, psychotic break. They weaponized my exhaustion, my discipline, and my intense privacy, feeding a stream of carefully curated, malicious lies to a doctor who was being paid handsomely to rubber stamp my destruction. Your Honor, my father's attorney, a slick, aggressive litigator named Vance, said softly, breaking the heavy silence of the courtroom. The medical evaluation provided by Dr. Thorne is conclusive and deeply tragic. Miss Harrington is suffering from a rapid, catastrophic neurodegenerative decline. She is currently managing a $40 million corporate entity. She is signing legally binding contracts. She is a massive walking liability to her employees, her shareholders, and most importantly, to herself. Vance paused, turning to look at me with a sickening display of faux pity. William and Margaret Harrington are not asking for control out of greed or malice, Your Honor, Vance continued, his voice dripping with righteous, desperate sympathy. They are begging this court to let them save their only daughter's life. They are requesting immediate, emergency status as guardians of the estate and guardians of the person. They need the authority to freeze her assets, step in as acting CEOs of Harrington Estates, and transition Claire into a secure, specialized residential care facility where she can receive the round-the-clock psychiatric treatment she so desperately requires. A secure residential care facility. It was a polite, sanitized legal term for a locked psychiatric ward. And if Judge Sterling signed the document resting in front of him, I would immediately, instantaneously, lose my fundamental human rights. I would not be able to vote, drive a car, sign a check, or choose where I lived. My parents would liquidate my $40 million empire, sell off my assets to the highest bidder, and I would spend the rest of my life locked behind a keypad-secured door, heavily sedated, completely erased from the civilized world. Judge Sterling let out a heavy, weary sigh. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He was an older man, respected, thorough, and entirely fooled by the tearful, Oscar-worthy performance happening at the petitioner's table. He looked down at the medical evaluation, the golden embossed seal of Dr. Thorne's practice gleaming under the warm courtroom lights. "This is an incredibly difficult petition," Judge Sterling said, his voice echoing heavily in the mahogany chamber. He looked over at me. "Ms. Harrington, well, the medical evidence presented here is overwhelming. Your own legal counsel has presented virtually no medical witnesses to rebut Dr. Thorne's diagnosis." It was true. The man sitting next to me, a cheap public defender tier probate attorney I had hired just 3 days ago, was entirely useless. He was nervously shuffling papers, sweating through his cheap suit, completely out of his depth. My parents thought I had hired him because my paranoia had alienated all the top tier, expensive law firms in the city. They thought I was broken. They thought I was sitting at the defense table in a state of catatonic shock, helplessly watching my empire burn to the ground. They had absolutely no idea that I had hired this incompetent lawyer on purpose. I needed them to feel overwhelmingly confident. I needed them to walk into this courtroom and officially submit forged documents to a sitting judge, permanently locking themselves into a charge of felony perjury. "Before I rule on this petition," Judge Sterling continued, picking up his heavy gold fountain pen, hovering it dangerously over the signature line of the permanent conservatorship order. "Do you have anything you wish to say in your defense, Miss Harrington?" Margaret stopped weeping for a fraction of a second, peeking through her linen handkerchief to watch me beg. William subtly tightened his jaw, ready to witness his final, absolute financial victory. I didn't blink. I didn't stammer. And I didn't launch into a hysterical, desperate monologue defending my sanity. I simply leaned back in my heavy leather chair, elegantly adjusted the cuffs of my Tom Ford suit, and let a cold, terrifying, razor-thin smile touch the corners of my mouth. "No, Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute freezing clarity. "I have absolutely nothing to add to the medical record, but I believe the woman currently standing outside the heavy oak doors of this courtroom might." The heavy, brass-studded oak doors at the back of probate courtroom 302 did not merely open, they were breached. They were thrown wide with a forceful, synchronized, and unapologetic physical authority that completely shattered the manufactured, mournful silence my parents had spent the last hour meticulously cultivating. The sudden, violent clack of the heavy wood striking the doorstops echoed like a gunshot against the high marble ceilings. Every single head in the courtroom, my father, my weeping mother, with their slick litigator, the court reporter, and the Honorable Judge Sterling, snapped toward the gallery aisle. I did not turn around. I remained perfectly seated at the defense table, my posture impeccably straight in my midnight blue Tom Ford suit, my dirty blonde chignon perfectly intact. I kept my pale blue eyes locked dead onto my father's face, watching with clinical, detached fascination as the first microscopic cracks began to form in his arrogant facade. When walking down the center aisle was a woman who fundamentally did not belong in a state-level probate hearing. She was in her early 50s, possessing sharp, angular features and short, impeccably styled silver-streaked hair. She was wearing a razor-sharp, tailored charcoal gray suit that practically radiated institutional dominance. She carried no purse. She offered no sympathetic glances. In her right hand, she gripped the thick, molded plastic handle of a secure, combination-locked federal evidence briefcase. Flanking her, a step behind on either side, were two men in dark suits who moved with the silent, terrifying synchronization of federal law enforcement. "Excuse me, Your Honor," Vance, my parents' aggressive litigator, sputtered. He scrambled to his feet, quickly buttoning his suit jacket, his voice dripping with territorial indignation and sudden panic. "This is a closed, sealed probate hearing. Or the gallery is restricted by a judicial gag order to immediate family and assigned medical counsel only. You cannot simply barge into this chamber." "Sit down, counselor," the woman in the gray suit interrupted. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her voice. She delivered the command with the flat, frictionless, and utterly devastating baritone of someone who was entirely accustomed to destroying high-priced defense attorneys before her first cup of morning coffee. She didn't even look at Vance. She treated him like a minor, irrelevant, buzzing insect. She strode past the wooden swinging gate that separated the gallery from the well of the court and walked directly toward the elevated oak bench. Judge Sterling took his gold fountain pen, which had been hovering dangerously over the signature line of my permanent conservatorship, and slowly placed it down on his blotter, his brow furrowed in deep judicial confusion. "Ma'am, Mr. Vance is entirely correct. This is a sealed medical competency hearing. I am going to have to ask you to identify yourself immediately, or I will have my bailiff remove you and your associates from my courtroom." The woman stopped exactly 3 feet from the bench. She reached into the breast pocket of her charcoal gray blazer, pulled out a worn leather credential case, and flipped it open with a sharp snap of her wrist. The heavy, gold shield of the United States Department of Justice caught the warm, ambient light of the courtroom chandeliers. "Sarah Caldwell," she announced, her voice echoing with absolute uncompromising authority. "Senior Assistant United States Attorney for the Financial Crimes and Public Integrity Task Force. And with all due respect to the state jurisdiction of this court, Your Honor, I am not here to violate a medical seal. I am here because this courtroom is currently being utilized as a staging ground to execute a massive, premeditated federal felony." The temperature in probate courtroom 302 seemed to plummet instantly to absolute zero. At the petitioner's table, Margaret Harrington's theatrical weeping performance abruptly died in her throat. She lowered her monogrammed linen handkerchief, her eyes wide, staring at the gold federal shield as if it were a venomous snake. William, my father, swallowed hard, and the prominent vein in his neck began to throb. The stoic, brave patriarch mask was completely gone, replaced by the raw, primal realization of a wealthy man who suddenly senses a trap closing around his ankles. "A federal felony?" Judge Sterling repeated, leaning forward over his heavy oak bench, his judicial annoyance instantly transforming into sharp, highly alert caution. Ms. Caldwell, this is a standard conservatorship petition. The petitioners are attempting to secure emergency medical and financial guardianship for a daughter suffering from rapid onset neurodegenerative decline. What possible federal interest does the Department of Justice have in Ms. Harrington's cognitive state? The Department of Justice has absolutely zero interest in Ms. Harrington's cognitive state, Your Honor, Prosecutor Caldwell stated flawlessly. She placed her heavy, locked evidence briefcase onto the polished wood of the evidence podium. Because Ms. Harrington's cognitive state is flawless. She is the chief executive officer of a $40 million commercial real estate empire, operating with an entirely pristine corporate compliance record. Caldwell turned her head slightly, locking her cold prosecutorial gaze directly onto my parents. Our interest, Your Honor, lies entirely in the medical dossier currently resting on your desk, Caldwell continued, her voice dropping into a lethal surgical register. Specifically, the 200-page psychiatric evaluation submitted into the official court record this morning by Dr. Eris Thorne. Vance, the parent's lawyer, panicked. He threw his hands up, a desperate attempt to block the incoming federal strike. Objection, Your Honor. The federal prosecutor is making baseless, defamatory claims without any evidentiary foundation. Dr. Thorne is one of the most respected board-certified psychiatric specialists in this city. On his evaluation of Claire Harrington was exhaustive, peer-reviewed, and conducted over a period of 6 months. I sat at the defense table, completely still, my hands folded elegantly in my lap. I watched my father grip the edge of his table so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He knew exactly what was happening, but he was trapped in a locked courtroom, entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own hubris. Dr. Thorne is a fraud, counselor, Caldwell fired back, completely ignoring Vance's objection and addressing the judge directly. He's a high society mercenary who specializes in fabricating medical pathologies for wealthy clients who need to legally neutralize their business rivals, inconvenient spouses, or, in this horrific instance, their own flesh and blood. Judge Sterling looked down at the beautiful gold-embossed medical dossier in front of him. It suddenly looked less like a tragedy and more like a live grenade. Those are incredibly heavy accusations, Counselor Caldwell, Judge Sterling warned, his voice grave. If you are suggesting that a board-certified physician submitted perjured medical documents to my court in an attempt to fraudulently secure a $40 million estate, you had better have the federal indictments to back it up. I don't just have the indictments, Your Honor, Caldwell said smoothly. She reached down and spun the combination dials on her federal briefcase. When the locks disengaged with a loud, heavy clack, she popped the lid open. I have the doctor. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. At 6:15 this morning, Caldwell announced, pulling a thick sealed federal evidence folder from her briefcase. Agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation executed a no-knock raid on Dr. Eris Thorne's private clinic, his primary residence, and his offshore holding accounts. He is currently sitting in an interrogation room at the federal building downtown, completely cooperating with the Department of Justice under a proffer agreement. Caldwell stepped forward, holding the sealed folder out to the bailiff, who immediately transferred it up to Judge Sterling's bench. Inside that folder, Your Honor, is Dr. Thorne's signed sworn confession. Caldwell delivered the lethal blow with breathtaking precision, detailing exactly how William and Margaret Harrington paid him a $300,000 bribe, routed through a Shell Marine Conservation charity, to completely fabricate the dementia diagnosis you are currently holding in your hands. The silence that followed Prosecutor Caldwell's announcement was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum, the kind that precedes a catastrophic implosion. Judge Sterling's face tightened into a mask of pure, judicial fury, and he did not immediately speak. He reached out, took the thick, sealed federal evidence folder from his bailiff, and broke the red tamper-evident tape. He pulled out the crisp, white document. Dr. Eris Thorne's signed, sworn, and fully executed federal proffer agreement and confession. His eyes scanned the first page, tracking the clinical, undeniable admission of a $300,000 medical bribe. At the petitioner's table, the theatrical performance of maternal grief had violently collapsed into genuine, unadulterated terror. Margaret Harrington, my 60-year-old mother, was gripping the edge of the mahogany table so hard her knuckles were bone white. The monogrammed linen handkerchief fluttered uselessly to the floor. William, my 65-year-old father, was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, his expensive navy pinstripe suit suddenly looking like a straitjacket. Vance, their slick, aggressive litigator, was physically backing away from them. The survival instinct of a high-priced lawyer is a terrifying thing to witness. Vance knew that if he remained standing next to my parents, the radioactive fallout of their federal crimes would permanently end his legal career. "Your Honor," Vance stammered, holding his hands up, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He didn't look at his clients. He looked exclusively at the judge. "I must formally and immediately state for the record that my firm had absolutely zero knowledge of any financial arrangements between the petitioners and Dr. Thorne. We received the medical dossier under the presumption of absolute clinical integrity. I move to instantly withdraw as counsel for William and Margaret Harrington." "Sit down and remain silent, Mr. Vance," Judge Sterling ordered, his voice echoing like thunder in the high-ceilinged chamber. Then he didn't even look up from the confession. "Nobody is leaving this courtroom." I sat at the defense table, exactly 15 feet away, a spectator in my own slaughterhouse. I am 39 years old, a woman with sharp, unapologetic American features. My dirty blonde hair remained pulled into a flawless, severe chignon, not a single strand out of place. My pale blue eyes remained locked on my father's face. The midnight blue Tom Ford suit I wore felt like armor. I hadn't spoken a single word in 20 minutes, yet I was the absolute, undeniable architect of every breath being taken in that room. Judge Sterling finally finished reading the first 2 pages of the federal confession. He slowly lowered the document, took off his reading glasses, and looked directly at Senior Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Caldwell. "Counselor Caldwell," Judge Sterling began, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "If the Federal Bureau of Investigation raided Dr. Thorne's clinic at 6:15 this morning, that means your Financial Crimes Task Force has been actively investigating this psychiatrist for months. How did a high society concierge doctor in my jurisdiction suddenly end up on the radar of the United States Department of Justice?" Caldwell, standing perfectly straight in her tailored charcoal gray suit, did not smile. She simply turned her sharp, angular features toward my defense table. "He didn't end up on our radar by accident, Your Honor," Caldwell stated cleanly, her baritone voice carrying a profound institutional respect. "The Department of Justice was handed Dr. Thorne on an absolute silver platter by the Chief Executive Officer of Harrington Estates." My mother let out a sharp, horrified gasp. She whipped her head around, her tear-streaked face staring at me in absolute disbelief. My father physically flinched, as if the words had actually struck him. 7 months ago, Your Honor," Caldwell explained, pacing slowly back to her federal evidence briefcase, commanding the courtroom with effortless Sorkin-esque rhythm. Ms. Harrington noticed that her parents were asking an unusual amount of highly specific questions regarding her corporate succession plans and the voting structure of her board of directors. A week later, she noticed her mother had quietly liquidated 3 minor family trusts. Ms. Harrington did not panic. She did not confront them. She simply utilized the resources available to a $40 million corporate entity. Caldwell reached into her briefcase and pulled out a second, significantly thicker binder, aggressively dropping it onto the podium with a loud thud. Ms. Harrington deployed a specialized team of forensic corporate auditors, Caldwell revealed, delivering the technical autopsy of my trap. They ran a complete clandestine financial background check on her own parents. They tracked the liquidation of the trusts. They followed the money straight into a supposed marine conservation charity managed by Margaret Harrington. And from there, they tracked a single, heavily obfuscated wire transfer of $300,000 directly into a Cayman Islands shell account, legally controlled by Dr. Aries Thorne. "Good God," Judge Sterling whispered, staring at me with a sudden profound realization of exactly who he was dealing with. I wasn't a fragile, demented daughter. I was an apex predator who had been sitting quietly in his courtroom, letting the prey walk willingly into the cage. Once Ms. Harrington's auditors identified the bribe, Caldwell continued, her eyes locked onto my father's completely drained, terrified face. She didn't stop there. She ordered her team to quietly audit Dr. Thorne's public Medicare billing records. They uncovered a systemic 5-year pattern of insurance fraud. 4 months ago, Ms. Harrington's legal team walked into my federal office, handed me a perfectly indexed, bulletproof financial dossier, and gave the FBI everything we needed to utterly destroy Dr. Thorne's life. "If you had this evidence 4 months ago," Judge Sterling started, his brow furrowing as he processed the timeline. He looked at Caldwell, then looked directly at me. "Why wait? Why allow your parents to drag you through a 6-month psychological evaluation? Why let this petition reach my courtroom? You could have stopped this conservatorship before it even began." I didn't answer. I simply maintained my icy, unblinking gaze on my father, letting the sheer, terrifying weight of my silence answer for me. "Because of the legal mechanics of deniability, Your Honor," Caldwell answered smoothly, translating my silence into federal law. If Ms. Harrington had simply exposed the bribe 4 months ago, William and Margaret Harrington would have hired a team of aggressive crisis PR firms. They would have claimed they were victims of extortion. They would have claimed Dr. Thorne demanded the money to keep quiet about a genuine medical issue. They would have tied the Department of Justice up in appellate courts for a decade, bleeding Ms. Harrington's company dry with legal fees. Caldwell leaned forward, gripping the edges of the podium, her voice dropping to a freezing, surgical whisper that echoed perfectly in the silent chamber. "Ms. Harrington didn't just want to stop the conservatorship, Your Honor," Caldwell stated, delivering the absolute, undeniable checkmate. She wanted to permanently, legally eradicate the threat to her corporate empire. She needed to establish an unbreakable chain of federal custody. Caldwell gestured sharply toward the forged medical dossier resting on the judge's bench. "By waiting," Caldwell explained, the devastating logic crashing down onto my parents' heads. By sitting in silence and allowing her parents to confidently walk into this sealed courtroom, she allowed them to formally, officially submit forged medical documents to a sitting judge. She allowed them to swear under oath that those documents were real. She didn't just catch them planning a crime, Your Honor. She successfully forced them to execute a massive, non-deniable act of felony perjury and conspiracy to commit fraud directly on the judicial record. William Harrington slumped back into his chair. The 65-year-old patriarch looked as though the gravity in the room had suddenly increased tenfold. He stared at me, his 39-year-old daughter, sitting perfectly composed in her Tom Ford suit, her pale blue eyes devoid of any biological warmth, and finally understood the catastrophic, fatal error he had made. And he had tried to play chess against a woman who owned the board. And just to ensure there is absolutely no ambiguity regarding their intent, Your Honor, Caldwell announced, reaching into her charcoal gray blazer and pulling out a small encrypted federal flash drive. Dr. Thorne wasn't just cooperative this morning, he was proactive. When he provided the FBI with the high-fidelity audio recordings of every single consultation he had with the Harringtons over the last 6 months. Judge Sterling did not hesitate. The profound, respectful deference he normally afforded to wealthy, established families in his probate courtroom had entirely evaporated. He stared at the small, encrypted federal flash drive pinched between Prosecutor Caldwell's fingers as if it were a vial of weaponized anthrax. "Mrs. Caldwell," Judge Sterling said, his voice stripped of all judicial warmth, replaced by the hard, unforgiving resonance of a magistrate who had just realized his courtroom was being used to facilitate a corporate hijacking. "Does the defense table have the technical capacity to play that federal audio file for the official court record immediately?" My public defender tier attorney, who had spent the last 30 minutes sweating through his cheap polyblend suit and questioning every life choice that had brought him into this room, scrambled frantically to open his battered laptop. "Actually, Your Honor," Caldwell smoothly interjected, bypassing my utterly useless legal counsel with a crisp, professional pivot. "The Department of Justice anticipated the need for immediate playback. My agents have already synced a secure, Bluetooth-enabled federal field tablet to your courtroom's primary stenography audio-visual system." She nodded sharply to the federal agent standing to her right. The man in the dark suit stepped forward, tapped the screen of a sleek black tablet, and looked up at the judge for final authorization. "Play it," Judge Sterling commanded, slamming his heavy wooden gavel down once, the sharp crack echoing violently against the marble walls, illegally sealing the fate of William and Margaret Harrington. The courtroom's high-fidelity speakers hummed to life. The audio began with the distinct, undeniable sound of a heavy crystal decanter clinking against a highball glass. It was ambient noise perfectly captured by the high-end recording equipment Dr. Aris Thorne kept hidden in his opulent, mahogany-paneled psychiatric office. Then, my father's voice filled the room. "I don't care what the specific DSM-5 terminology is. Doris!" William Harrington's recorded voice boomed through the speakers. It was not the voice of a grieving, desperate father trying to save his sick daughter. It was the ruthless, arrogant, and highly agitated voice of a cornered financial predator. Dementia, severe paranoia, acute schizophrenia. Pick the pathology that requires the heaviest sedation and the most airtight, locked-ward residential facility. I just need her signature legally neutralized before the end of the fiscal quarter. At the petitioner's table, William physically recoiled. His 65-year-old body jerked backward as if the audio playback had actually struck him in the chest. His expensive navy pinstripe suit, which had projected such unassailable patriarchal authority an hour ago, now looked entirely absurd. He opened his mouth to speak, to object, to scream, but the absolute, crushing reality of the federal evidence choked the words back down his throat. "The IPO is moving forward in 6 weeks," William's recorded voice continued, his tone dripping with profound sociopathic entitlement. "Claire is restructuring the board. She's freezing us out of the primary equity pools. We gave her the seed money 15 years ago, Aris. We built her. I am not going to let an ungrateful, workaholic 39-year-old lock me out of a $40 million liquidity event just because she thinks she built Harrington Estates by herself." I sat perfectly still at the defense table. I am 39 years old, possessing striking, cold American features. My dirty blonde hair remained pulled back into its severe, flawless chignon. My pale blue eyes remained fixed on my father. The midnight blue Tom Ford suit I wore felt like a tailored suit of armor. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. Oh no, I simply watched the structural collapse of my father's ego with the detached, clinical precision of an auditor finding a fatal error in a spreadsheet. William is right, heiress. My mother's voice suddenly chimed in on the recording, her tone sharp, calculating, and completely devoid of maternal warmth. In the courtroom, Margaret Harrington let out a whimpering, pathetic gasp. She buried her face in her hands, her beautifully styled 60-year-old blonde hair trembling as the sheer, non-deniable cruelty of her own words echoed off the high marble ceilings. "Claire is entirely out of control," Margaret's recorded voice complained, the ice clinking in her glass. "She works 100-hour weeks. She has no husband, no children, no attachments. She is a machine. If we don't step in and establish this conservatorship now, she's going to donate the entire corporate philanthropic fund to some urban development initiative instead of my marine charity. She's wasting our legacy. I just write the evaluation, Aris. We'll wire the $300,000 to the Cayman account by Friday. Just make sure the judge believes her mind is completely gone." "The diagnosis will be airtight, Margaret." Dr. Thorne's smooth, heavily compensated voice finally answered on the tape. "Frontotemporal dementia compounded by paranoid delusions. When she stands in front of the judge, her own cold, stoic demeanor will just look like catatonic detachment. They'll hand you the keys to her company in 10 minutes. The federal agent tapped the tablet screen. The audio abruptly cut out, plunging probate courtroom 302 back into a deafening, terrifying silence. The silence lasted for 10 agonizing seconds. Nobody breathed. The court reporter's fingers hovered, frozen over her steno machine. Vance, the aggressive litigator who had confidently marched into this room expecting an easy, lucrative victory, was now actively pressing his back against the wooden railing of the gallery, trying to physically distance himself from the radioactive epicenter of my parents' crimes. Judge Sterling slowly raised his head. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated judicial revulsion. He looked at Margaret, who was hyperventilating into her hands, and then he looked directly at William. "In my 25 years on the bench," Judge Sterling whispered, his voice shaking with a cold, uncontrolled fury that was far more terrifying than a shout, "I have presided over bitter divorces, vicious corporate disputes, and tragic family collapses. But I have never, in my entire career, witnessed a betrayal so breathtakingly cruel, so meticulously premeditated, and so fundamentally sociopathic as the one I have just heard in this courtroom." Judge Sterling picked up the 200-page, gold-embossed medical dossier that my parents had paid $300,000 to fabricate, and he held it up in the air for a single second, letting the weight of the perjury hang in the room before violently throwing it into the heavy plastic trash can beside his desk. "The petition for involuntary conservatorship over the estate and person of Ms. Claire Harrington is hereby denied, with extreme, absolute prejudice," Judge Sterling barked, his voice returning to its full, booming authority. He slammed his gavel down again, and he then turned his attention to the senior assistant United States attorney standing calmly in the well of the court. "Counselor Caldwell," Judge Sterling said, his eyes locking onto the federal prosecutor, "as a sitting state judge, my jurisdiction ends at the denial of this petition. However, I have just witnessed 2 individuals submit a fraudulently obtained, perjured medical document into my official court record under penalty of perjury. That is a direct, undeniable felony contempt of this court. I am ordering my bailiffs to detain William and Margaret Harrington immediately, and I am formally remanding them directly into federal custody." At the petitioner's table, William Harrington's mind finally broke. The 65-year-old patriarch, realizing that his wealth, his political connections, and his expensive navy pinstripe suit could not stop the crushing weight of the United States Department of Justice, leapt to his feet. "Wait, Claire! William screamed, abandoning all pretense of dignity, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate wail. He lunged toward the center aisle, reaching out toward me with trembling, manic hands. "Claire, please, you can't let them do this. We are your parents. We gave you everything. You have to stop them. Tell them it's a mistake." I didn't flinch. I didn't break eye contact. I slowly, elegantly stood up from my heavy leather chair, unbuttoned the center button of my midnight blue Tom Ford suit, and prepared to deliver the final lethal blow to the empire they had tried to steal. "Claire!" William screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, desperate wail that completely shattered his patriarchal facade. He lunged toward the center aisle, reaching out toward me with trembling, manic hands. "Claire, please, you can't let them do this. We are your parents. We gave you everything. You have to stop them. Why, tell them it's a mistake." I didn't flinch. I didn't break eye contact. I slowly, elegantly stood up from my heavy leather chair. I buttoned the center button of my midnight blue Tom Ford suit, smoothing the immaculate fabric. I am 39 years old, a woman with sharp, unapologetic American features. My dirty blonde hair pulled into a flawless, severe chignon. My pale blue eyes remained entirely devoid of biological warmth as I looked down at the 65-year-old man in the navy pinstripe suit who had just tried to bury me alive. "You didn't give me everything, William," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, surgical precision that cut through his hysterical sobbing like a scalpel. "You gave me a $500,000 seed loan 15 years ago. One a loan that I fully amortized and paid back with an 18% compounding interest rate, exactly 36 months later. I possess the wire transfer receipts to prove it." I took a deliberate step out from behind the defense table, closing the distance just enough to let the absolute zero temperature of my anger radiate into his bones. "You didn't build me," I continued, my tone dropping into a freezing, uncompromising whisper. "I built Harrington Estates while you were playing golf and Margaret was hosting charity galas to feed her own narcissism. I worked the 100-hour weeks. I managed the supply chains. I took the market risks. But the second I prepared to take my company public, you realized your entirely unearned access to my corporate liquidity was coming to an end. So, instead of adjusting your lifestyle, you decided to hire a corrupt mercenary to lock your only daughter in a psychiatric ward. Margaret, and her 60-year-old face ruined by tears, and her expensive blonde hair finally falling out of its perfect styling, let out a wretched, suffocating gasp from the petitioner's table. "Claire, we love you," Margaret choked out, her hands trembling violently. "We were just scared. We just wanted to protect our family's legacy." "Your legacy is a $300,000 wire transfer to a Cayman Islands shell account, Margaret," I fired back, while completely severing the maternal tie with undeniable federal evidence. "You were perfectly willing to have me heavily sedated and stripped of my fundamental human rights, just so you could keep funding a fake marine charity. You are not my family. You are a hostile corporate liability. And as the chief executive officer of this estate, I have just successfully liquidated you." I turned my back on them and looked at Senior Assistant United States Attorney Sarah Caldwell. The woman in the charcoal gray suit did not smile, but a glint of profound predatory respect flashed in her sharp eyes. Caldwell gave a single sharp nod to the two federal agents standing behind her. They moved with terrifying, frictionless efficiency. The two men in dark suits stepped seamlessly past the wooden swinging gate, completely ignoring Vance, the slick litigator who was now actively pressing himself against the far wall of the courtroom, desperately trying to become invisible. "William and Margaret Harrington," the lead federal agent commanded, grabbing William's arm and forcefully wrenching it behind his back. The heavy metallic clack of federal handcuffs locking around the patriarch's wrists echoed violently against the high marble ceilings. "You are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud," federal bribery of a medical official, and severe violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. "No, please, Arthur." "I call the governor!" Margaret shrieked hysterically as the second agent grabbed her arms, pinning them behind her cashmere draped back and locking the steel cuffs around her wrists. William didn't fight. The reality of the 4K digital audio recording and the federal proffer agreement had completely lobotomized his will to resist. He simply went limp, his expensive navy suit crumpling as the agents forcefully marched him toward the heavy oak doors. Now they were escorted down the center aisle of probate courtroom 302. They didn't look back at me. They didn't have the strength. The heavy doors swung shut behind them, sealing their fate and leaving the courtroom in a stunned, breathless silence. Judge Sterling sat heavily back in his elevated leather chair. He took a long, slow breath, looking out over the empty petitioner's table, the discarded, fraudulently obtained medical dossier resting in his trash can, and finally, at me. "Ms. I. Harrington," Judge Sterling said, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and profound respect. "This court officially recognizes you as an entirely competent, independent, and legally autonomous adult. You are free to go." "Thank you, Your Honor," I replied smoothly. I picked up my slim leather briefcase, turned on my heel, and walked out of the courtroom. The fallout was a masterpiece of federal efficiency. Because I had handed Prosecutor Caldwell an unbreakable, undeniably authenticated chain of custody, the DOJ didn't even need to offer a plea deal. They brought the hammer down with biblical force. Under the RICO statutes, the FBI executed total immediate asset forfeiture on my parents. They seized William's country club shares, froze Margaret's offshore accounts, and auctioned off their sprawling suburban estate to pay the federal fines. 9 months later, a federal judge sentenced Dr. Eris Thorne to 12 years in a maximum security penitentiary. William and Margaret, entirely unable to handle the brutal reality of a federal trial, pleaded guilty to all charges. They were sentenced to 10 years each in a federal correctional facility. They were permanently, hopelessly ruined. As for me, the Harrington Estates' initial public offering launched exactly 6 weeks after the courtroom trap was sprung. Without my parents' parasitic interference, the market responded with overwhelming enthusiasm. The IPO was massively oversubscribed, and effectively doubling my company's valuation to $80 million on the first day of trading. I sit in the exact same penthouse corner office. The mahogany desk is spotless. The floor-to-ceiling windows still overlook the city's skyline I built from the ground up. And my mind remains absolutely, flawlessly my own. If your own parents forged medical records, bribed a corrupt psychiatrist with $300,000, Urine tried to lock you in a psychiatric ward just to steal your $40 million empire, would you have given them a chance to explain themselves? Or would you have quietly deployed forensic corporate auditors, flipped the doctor to the FBI, and let your parents walk into a sealed courtroom to commit felony perjury right in front of a sitting judge? Let me know exactly how you would handle this level of sociopathic financial betrayal in the comments below. If you loved this story of cold, calculating, bulletproof justice, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.